They say revenge is a dish best served cold. I disagree. The best revenge is watching people destroy themselves with their own poison while you do absolutely nothing. I'm sitting in my empty house now, divorce papers signed 3 months ago, and I can still smell the faint trace of Helen's perfume in the guest room. Funny how some scents linger longer than the people who wore them. 5 years of marriage gone in a single week. That's all it took for my mother-in-law to destroy everything Jessica and I had built together. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Jessica and I were genuinely happy. I know that sounds like something every divorced man says, but it was true. We had something real in our modest 3-bedroom ranch house on Maple Street. I worked as a maintenance supervisor at Patterson Manufacturing. Steady work with good benefits. Jessica managed our home, and we'd built a life that felt complete. Simple pleasures. Friday night movies on our worn leather couch. Saturday morning pancakes that Jessica made from scratch. Sunday afternoons working in the garden she'd started behind the house. We weren't wealthy, but we were content. We chose each other every day, and that felt like enough. More than enough. Helen's arrival changed everything, though I didn't see it coming at first. Just a week, Jessica had said when she asked if her mother could stay while her house was being fumigated. The chemicals are too strong, and you know how her lungs are. I nodded, even helped carry Helen's suitcases to the guest room. What choice did I have? She was my wife's mother, and Jessica loved her despite everything. Helen started her work immediately. The first night at dinner, she looked around our kitchen with that expression I'd learned to recognize, the one that said she was cataloging our failures. "This is cozy," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone that made compliments sound like criticisms. "Very simple." Jessica's smile faltered slightly. "We like it. It's perfect for us." "Of course, dear." Helen's fingers traced the edge of our wooden table, the one Jessica had found at a garage sale and refinished herself. "I just remember when Sarah Morrison bought that gorgeous colonial in Riverside. 5 bedrooms, 3 full baths. Her husband really knows how to provide." I watched Jessica's face change, saw the seed of doubt being planted. Sarah Morrison had been Jessica's high school friend, someone she rarely mentioned anymore. "Tom provides perfectly well," Jessica said, but her voice lacked conviction. Helen smiled that smile, the one that never reached her eyes. "Of course he does, sweetheart. You've always been good at making the best of things." The conversation moved on, but the damage was done. I could see it in Jessica's eyes as she looked around our kitchen with fresh dissatisfaction. The next morning, I found Helen in the living room, examining our bookshelf with the same clinical interests she'd shown the kitchen. "You know," she said when Jessica joined us, "I was talking to Linda yesterday. Her daughter just got back from Paris. Second honeymoon? Can you imagine? 25 years married, and her husband still treats her like a queen." Jessica poured her coffee without responding, but I saw her shoulders tense. "I told her about you two, of course. How sweet it is that you're so settled. Some women are just naturally homebodies, I suppose." "There's nothing wrong with being a homebody," I said, unable to keep quiet any longer. Helen's eyes fixed on me with barely concealed contempt. "Of course not. It's just that Jessica was always so ambitious in high school, remember, honey? You were going to see the world, do something important with your life." "I am doing something important," Jessica said quietly. "I'm building a life with my husband." "Yes, dear, and you're very good at it." Helen's tone suggested this was somehow tragic. "I just wonder sometimes if you ever think about what might have been. You're still so young and beautiful. Don't you ever wonder what else is out there?" I tried to counter Helen's poison throughout that week. When she criticized our furniture, I reminded Jessica how proud she'd been when we'd saved enough to buy our first real dining set. When Helen made pointed comments about our vacation to Lake George, I talked about how much fun we'd had hiking and fishing together. But every attempt made me look defensive, made me sound like I was trying to convince Jessica to be happy with less. Helen was too skilled for direct confrontation. She wrapped her manipulation in motherly concern, made her poison sound like wisdom. "I just want you to reach your full potential," she'd say, stroking Jessica's hair. "You're settling for less than you deserve, and it breaks my heart." I watched my wife changing day by day. She started looking at our house with different eyes, seeing flaws where she'd once seen charm. She grew distant during our evening conversations, distracted when we watched our Friday night movies. By the end of the week, Helen had escalated her campaign. She suggested Jessica join a gym, get her hair done at a better salon, start going out with some of her old friends again. "You're still young and beautiful," she told Jessica over breakfast on her last day. "Don't let this be your whole life. You deserve so much more." The words hung in the air like a curse. I realized then that Helen wasn't just trying to make Jessica dissatisfied with our life. She was actively pushing her toward infidelity. She was grooming my wife for betrayal, and Jessica was too blind to see it. That night, after Helen had gone home, I lay awake listening to Jessica's breathing and understanding with crystal clarity that my mother-in-law had declared war on my marriage. She'd planted seeds of discontent that would grow into something that would destroy everything I'd built. The old me would have confronted Jessica directly, would have tried to talk through her newfound dissatisfaction. But something had changed in me during that week of watching Helen's systematic destruction of my wife's happiness. I was starting to think strategically, and I realized that if Helen wanted to play games, I needed to understand the rules. The poison had taken root, and I was going to have to decide whether to fight it or let it grow until it consumed everything Helen held dear. Jessica's transformation began immediately after Helen left. Within days, she'd joined FitLife, an upscale gym across town that cost 3 times what our old gym membership had been. I said nothing when she announced it, just nodded and asked if she needed help with the paperwork. "Mom's treating me," she said, not meeting my eyes. "She thinks I deserve to take better care of myself." Helen's money, Helen's influence, Helen's poison. I watched my wife of 5 years start to become someone I didn't recognize. The expensive haircuts came next. Jessica's beautiful brown hair styled into something edgy and attention-grabbing. Then the clothes, form-fitting workout gear that she wore even when she wasn't exercising, dresses that clung to her body in ways that invited stares. "You look beautiful," I told her one evening when she emerged from the bedroom in a black dress I'd never seen before. "Thanks," she said, but her tone was flat, distracted. She was checking her phone, always checking her phone now. The emotional distance grew wider each day. Jessica would come home from her workouts, glowing with endorphins and excitement, but that energy never extended to our conversations. She'd shower, change clothes, and retreat to her phone or laptop. Our evening talks became stilted, our weekend routines abandoned. "How was the gym?" I'd ask. "Fine." "Good. The trainer says I'm making real progress." "That's great. Maybe I could come with you sometime, see what it's about." "It's not really your kind of place, Tom. Very focused, serious people." The subtext was clear. I wasn't serious enough, focused enough, good enough for her new world. I started paying attention to details I'd never noticed before. Jessica's phone, which used to sit casually on the kitchen counter, now went everywhere with her. She'd angle it away from me when texting, delete messages immediately after reading them. She started working out longer, coming home later, always with elaborate explanations about new classes or equipment orientation. The lies were clumsy at first, but they got smoother as she got more practice. I'd call the gym during hours she claimed to be there, only to be told she'd left 30 minutes earlier. She'd mention conversations with trainers who didn't exist, classes that weren't on the schedule. Helen called regularly now, always when I was at work. Jessica would spend long minutes on these calls, her voice animated in ways it never was when she talked to me anymore. When I'd ask about the conversations, Jessica would brush them off as just mom stuff, but I could see the renewed energy these talks gave her. "Your mother seems to be calling a lot lately," I said one evening. "She's just being supportive. She understands what I'm going through." "What you're going through?" Jessica's face hardened. "Growing, changing, becoming who I'm supposed to be." Helen's words, spoken in Jessica's voice. The poison had taken complete hold. I started my own investigation quietly, methodically. I noticed that Jessica's car had more miles on it than her claimed activities would account for. I found receipts for restaurants I'd never been to, coffee shops across town from the gym. Her laundry started including clothes that never made it to our bedroom. Expensive items that disappeared as quickly as they'd appeared. The breakthrough came by accident. Jessica had left her phone charging in the kitchen while she showered, and a text came through from someone named Marcus. The preview was enough. "Can't wait to see you tonight. Wear that red dress." I stared at the phone, my hands shaking slightly. The red dress was hanging in our closet, tags still on it. Something Jessica had claimed to have bought for a future occasion. Tonight, she told me she was going to a new yoga class that ran late. I could have confronted her then. Part of me wanted to storm into the bathroom and demand answers, but something held me back. Maybe it was the strategic thinking that Helen's manipulation had awakened in me. Or maybe it was the understanding that Jessica was too far gone to be saved by confrontation. Instead, I waited until Jessica left for her yoga class, then I accessed our phone records online. 3 months of calls and texts to Marcus Santos, increasing in frequency and duration. I cross-referenced his name with Jessica's new gym and found him listed as a personal trainer and fitness consultant. The affair was fully developed, had been going on for weeks. I scrolled through itemized phone bills, seeing the pattern of communication that showed a relationship progressing from professional to personal to intimate. Hour-long calls during my workdays, text conversations that lasted deep into the night after Jessica had gone to bed, claiming exhaustion. I confronted the evidence with a strange sense of calm. The betrayal wasn't surprising. Helen had been orchestrating it from the beginning. What surprised me was how thoroughly Jessica had embraced it, how completely she'd abandoned our marriage for Helen's vision of what her life should be. When Jessica came home that night, glowing and energized in a way she never was after actual exercise, I was waiting in the living room with a beer and a book, the picture of a trusting husband. "How was yoga?" I asked. "Challenging. Really pushed myself tonight." She smiled, and I saw the woman I'd married flickering behind the stranger she'd become. "I think I'm finally getting somewhere." "It's great. I'm proud of you for working so hard." The words felt like ash in my mouth, but I said them anyway. Jessica needed to believe she was getting away with it, needed to feel safe in her deception until I was ready to act. Over the following days, I gathered more evidence. I found text messages when Jessica left her phone unattended. Explicit conversations that revealed not just the physical affair, but her complete emotional betrayal. She talked about me with contempt, called our marriage a mistake, expressed excitement about her new relationship and her plans for the future. The most damaging evidence came from messages between Jessica and Helen. My mother-in-law didn't know the specific details of the affair, but she was actively encouraging Jessica to explore her options and see what else is out there. She told Jessica she had every right to be happy and shouldn't feel guilty about putting herself first. Helen was giving Jessica permission to cheat, framing infidelity as self-empowerment and delayed adolescence. The manipulation was more thorough than I'd imagined. Helen had systematically destroyed Jessica's moral compass and replaced it with selfish justification. I copied everything, documented every lie, every secret meeting, every expression of contempt for our marriage. The evidence was overwhelming, but I wasn't ready to use it yet. I needed Jessica to feel completely secure in her deception, needed her to believe she was in control of the situation. The final piece of evidence came when I found messages between Jessica and Marcus discussing their future together. She was already planning to leave me, already talking about the life she wanted to build with him. The divorce was coming whether I acted or not. The only question was whether I would be the victim or the architect of what happened next. That night, I lay in bed next to my wife, listening to her breathe and knowing that everything we'd built together was already gone. Helen had won, had successfully destroyed our marriage and turned Jessica into someone who could betray everything we'd promised each other. But Helen had made one critical mistake. She'd underestimated me. She thought I was weak, thought I would collapse under the weight of her manipulation. She had no idea that watching her systematic destruction of my marriage had taught me to think strategically, to plan carefully, to strike when victory was certain. The poison had done its work. Now it was time to let it spread to everyone who had helped plant it. I chose a Tuesday night for the confrontation. Jessica had told me she was going to a late fitness class, but I knew she was meeting Marcus at the hotel they'd been using for the past month. The location was perfect. It would give me enough time to prepare everything before she returned. I started by packing her belongings. Not everything, just enough to make the point clear. I folded her clothes carefully, packed her toiletries, gathered the jewelry and personal items she'd accumulated during our marriage. 3 suitcases and 2 boxes. 5 years of shared life reduced to manageable containers. I loaded everything into my truck and waited in the living room. The house felt different already, lighter somehow, as if Jessica's betrayal had been a weight I'd been carrying without realizing it. I sat in my chair with a beer and watched the clock, knowing exactly when she would return. Jessica's car pulled into the driveway at 10:47 p.m. I heard her key in the lock, heard her pause in the entryway when she saw me sitting there with her packed belongings beside me. "Tom, what's going on?" I pulled out my phone and showed her the screenshots I'd collected. Text messages between her and Marcus, photos they'd sent each other, conversations about their future plans. Jessica's face went white as she scrolled through the evidence. "I can explain." "No." My voice was calm, controlled. "You can't. There's nothing to explain. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine." I stood up and grabbed the handles of her suitcases. "I'm driving you to your parents' house. You can figure out what comes next from there." Jessica's shock was genuine. She'd been so comfortable in her deception that she'd never considered the possibility of being caught. "Tom, please, can't we talk about this? I never meant for this to happen." I walked past her to the truck, loading her belongings into the bed. "Get in the truck, Jessica. We're done talking." The ride to her parents' house was silent except for Jessica's intermittent attempts to explain, minimize, or shift blame. I ignored all of it, focused on the road ahead and the satisfaction of finally acting decisively after months of watching Helen's manipulation unfold. "This is crazy," Jessica said as we pulled into her parents' driveway. "You're throwing away 5 years of marriage over a mistake. People work through these things." I parked and started unloading her belongings. "Some people do. We're not going to be those people." I carried her suitcases to the front door and rang the bell. Robert answered, looking confused and concerned at the sight of his daughter's belongings on his doorstep. "Tom, what's going on?" "Ask Jessica," I said, handing him the last box. "She'll explain everything." I walked back to my truck without looking back, leaving Jessica on her parents' doorstep with her suitcases and the consequences of her choices. The drive home was the most peaceful I'd felt in months. Jessica immediately began spinning her version of events to her parents. I knew she would. It was the next logical step in her self-deception. She told them I'd thrown her out over nothing, that I'd been controlling and unreasonable, that I'd refused to listen to her explanations. Helen embraced this narrative immediately. She'd been waiting for this moment, had been preparing for it since the day she'd arrived for her week-long visit. This was validation of everything she'd said about me, proof that she'd been right all along. "I told you he wasn't good enough for you," she said, holding Jessica while she cried. "I knew this day would come. He was never worthy of you, sweetheart." Robert's protective instincts were triggered by what he believed was his daughter's mistreatment. Helen skillfully manipulated his emotions, directing his anger toward me while positioning herself as the wise mother who'd seen this coming. She painted me as the villain who'd callously destroyed his daughter's happiness over a minor indiscretion. "Someone needs to talk sense into that boy," Robert said, his voice tight with anger. "He can't just throw away a marriage like this. Jessica made a mistake, but marriage is about forgiveness." I knew Robert would come. He was a good man, a loving father who would do anything to protect his daughter. Helen would make sure of that, would fan his anger until he had no choice but to act. 2 days later, I was waiting in my kitchen when Robert's truck pulled into my driveway. I watched him walk to my door, his shoulders set with determination, his face hard with righteous anger. He knocked firmly, the sound echoing through my empty house. "We need to talk," he said when I opened the door. I stepped aside and let him in. "I figured you'd come." Robert's anger was immediate and intense. "What the hell is wrong with you? You throw my daughter out like garbage and won't even discuss it? 5 years of marriage and you ended over one mistake?" I didn't argue or defend myself. Instead, I walked to the kitchen table where I'd laid out printed copies of Jessica's text messages and photos. "Look at these, Robert. All of them." He started to protest, but something in my voice made him sit down and pick up the first page. I watched his face change as he read, saw the exact moment when his anger shifted from protective father to betrayed husband. The evidence was overwhelming. Jessica's affair wasn't a mistake or a moment of weakness. It was a calculated betrayal that had been going on for months. The text messages showed her contempt for our marriage, her excitement about her new relationship, her plans for a future that didn't include me. "Jesus Christ," Robert whispered, staring at a particularly explicit message. This is not the daughter I raised." "Keep reading," I said gently. "Look at the messages between Jessica and Helen." Robert's transformation was complete when he saw Helen's role in encouraging Jessica's affair. The messages showed Helen giving Jessica permission to cheat, framing infidelity as self-empowerment, actively undermining our marriage with her manipulation. "She knew," Robert said, his voice hollow. "Helen knew this was happening and encouraged it." I sat down across from him. "Helen orchestrated it. She's been working to destroy my marriage since the day she walked into my house. Jessica was just the weapon she used." Robert's anger was now directed exactly where it belonged. We sat in my kitchen, two men who had been victimized by Helen's manipulation, understanding each other perfectly for the first time. "I'm divorcing her," Robert said after a long silence. "I can't stay married to someone who would do this to our family." I nodded. "I figured you would. Helen won't stop until she's destroyed everything good in your life. She's been doing it for years, hasn't she?" Robert's laugh was bitter. 23 years of marriage, and I'm just now seeing it clearly. Every relationship she's interfered with, every friend she's driven away, every moment of happiness she's poisoned. She's been systematically destroying our family, and I've been too blind to see it. We talked for another hour, sharing stories of Helen's manipulation, understanding the pattern of her behavior. Robert left my house with copies of the evidence and a clear understanding of what he needed to do. The confrontation at Robert's house was explosive. Helen tried every manipulation technique she'd perfected over the years, but Robert had finally seen through her poison. He presented the evidence of her role in Jessica's affair, her systematic destruction of our marriage, her betrayal of everything their family was supposed to represent. Helen's denials were frantic and desperate. She tried to minimize her role, to redirect blame, to make herself the victim of circumstances beyond her control. But Robert had reached the same place I had. Complete clarity about who Helen really was and what she'd done to our lives. Jessica found herself caught in the middle of her parents' divorce, finally understanding that her mother's advice had cost her everything. Her attempts to contact me were ignored, her messages deleted unread. Marcus had lost interest once she was no longer the exciting married woman seeking escape from her mundane life. Within a week, Helen had lost her husband, her home, her influence over Jessica, and her standing in the community. The poison she'd spread so carefully had finally reached its intended target, herself. I watched the destruction from the peaceful sanctuary of my empty house, feeling no satisfaction in Helen's suffering, only relief that her influence was finally gone from my life. The counterattack had worked exactly as I'd planned, requiring no violence, no illegal activity, no compromise of my values. I'd simply revealed the truth and let people make their own choices about how to respond. Robert arrived at my house 3 days after I'd given him the evidence, but this time he wasn't angry. He was devastated. The man who'd walked into my kitchen ready for a fight had been replaced by someone who looked aged by decades of suppressed realization. "I confronted her," he said, sitting heavily in my kitchen chair. "Showed her everything. You should have seen her face when she realized I knew the truth." I poured him a cup of coffee and sat down across from him. "What did she say?" "Everything you'd expect. Denial, then minimization, then blame. She tried to convince me that she was just being a supportive mother, that Jessica's affair was none of her business." Robert's laugh was hollow. 23 years of marriage, and she looked me in the eye and lied like it was nothing. The conversation that followed was one of the most honest I'd ever had with another person. Robert revealed the years of manipulation he'd endured, the subtle ways Helen had undermined every relationship in their family. the pattern of destruction she'd left in her wake. "She drove away Jessica's first serious boyfriend in high school," he said, "convinced Jessica he was holding her back from her potential. Then she did the same thing to the boy Jessica dated in college. I thought she was just being protective, but now I see the pattern." Robert's decision to divorce Helen was final and immediate. He'd already consulted with a lawyer, had already started the process of separating their finances and assets. The revelation about Helen's role in Jessica's affair had been the final straw in a marriage that had been dying for years. "I'm not giving her another opportunity to destroy what's left of our family," he said. "Jessica's already lost her marriage because of Helen's poison. I won't let her destroy any more lives." That same evening, Robert returned home to face Helen with the full weight of his decision. The confrontation was everything I'd hoped it would be. Swift, decisive, and utterly final. Helen tried every manipulation technique she'd perfected over the years. She'd denied her role in Jessica's affair, claimed she was just being a supportive mother, accused Robert of being unreasonable and cruel. When denial failed, she tried to minimize her actions, suggesting that Jessica's marriage was doomed anyway, and she'd just helped her daughter see the truth. "You're destroying our family over nothing," Helen said, her voice rising to the hysterical pitch she used when her manipulation wasn't working. "I was trying to help Jessica be happy. If that boy was a real man, he would have fought for his marriage instead of throwing her away." Robert's response was calm and final. "You systematically destroyed their marriage, Helen. You manipulated our daughter into betraying her husband, and you did it because you enjoy destroying other people's happiness. I'm done being married to someone who would do that to our family." The divorce papers were served the next morning. Helen's lawyer tried to negotiate, but Robert had documented everything, had evidence of her manipulation and her role in Jessica's affair. The divorce would be quick and decisive, with Helen receiving only what the law required and nothing more. Jessica found herself caught between her parents' divorce and her own failed marriage, finally beginning to understand the extent of her mother's manipulation. Her attempts to contact me continued, but I ignored every call, every text, every email. She'd made her choice when she embraced Helen's poison, and I wasn't interested in explanations or apologies. Marcus had disappeared from her life as quickly as he'd entered it. The excitement of an affair with a married woman had lost its appeal once Jessica was single and available. She was left with nothing. No husband, no lover, no family support, and no home. The community aspect of the revenge became apparent as news of both divorces spread through our small town. Helen's reputation as a manipulative destroyer of marriages became public knowledge through the careful sharing of information by Robert and myself. We didn't gossip or spread rumors. We simply told the truth when asked, and the truth was damning enough. Helen's social circle contracted rapidly as people understood her true nature. The women who had once sought her advice began to question her motives, began to remember their own experiences with her manipulation. Friendships that had lasted decades evaporated as people realized they'd been tools in Helen's games. The isolation was complete and devastating. Helen had built her identity around her ability to manipulate and control others, and once that ability was exposed and neutralized, she had nothing left. She was forced to sell the house she'd shared with Robert, had to find new living arrangements, had to start over in a community that now understood exactly who she was. Jessica's world collapsed just as thoroughly. She lost her job when the stress of her situation affected her work performance. She had to move into a small apartment, had to learn to support herself for the first time in years. The comfortable life she'd taken for granted was gone, replaced by the harsh reality of consequences. Her attempts to reconcile with me became more desperate as her situation deteriorated. She called my work, showed up at my house uninvited, sent letters through mutual friends. All of it was ignored, all of it was futile. The woman who had betrayed our marriage for Helen's vision of a better life was learning that actions have consequences, and some consequences are permanent. The most devastating blow came when Jessica realized that her relationship with her father had been permanently damaged. Robert blamed her for enabling Helen's destruction, for choosing her mother's manipulation over her marriage. The family that Helen had claimed to be protecting was shattered beyond repair. 3 months after the confrontation, Helen was completely alone. She'd lost her husband, her home, her daughter, her social standing, and her identity. The woman who had systematically destroyed other people's happiness had finally destroyed herself with her own poison. The revelation phase was complete. Everyone who mattered now understood Helen's true nature, and the consequences of that understanding were swift and merciless. I hadn't had to become the villain because Helen's own actions had created her downfall. Justice had been served, and it was more perfect than anything I could have engineered myself. 6 months after the confrontation, I stood in my kitchen making morning coffee and realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd thought about Helen. The woman who had consumed so much of my mental energy, who had driven me to strategic thinking and careful planning, had simply faded from my consciousness like a bad dream. The aftermath had unfolded exactly as I'd anticipated. Helen's world had collapsed completely and permanently. She'd lost everything that mattered to her: her marriage, her home, her influence over Jessica, her social standing in the community. The divorce from Robert had been swift and devastating, leaving her with minimal assets and no support system. Robert had rebuilt his life with remarkable speed and determination. He'd sold the house he'd shared with Helen, bought a smaller place across town, and started dating a woman from his church, someone kind and genuine who represented everything Helen had never been. When I saw him at the grocery store, he looked younger, happier, free from the weight of Helen's manipulation. "Best decision I ever made," he told me, shaking my hand with genuine warmth. "I should have done it years ago. Thank you for opening my eyes." Jessica was living in a one-bedroom apartment downtown, working at a department store for the first time in her adult life. The transformation from pampered wife to struggling single woman had been harsh but educational. She'd learned to support herself, to make her own decisions, to face consequences without someone else to blame. Her attempts at reconciliation had stopped months ago, replaced by a grudging acceptance that our marriage was truly over. The last message she'd sent was brief and surprisingly mature. "I understand now what Mom did to us. I'm sorry for my part in it. I hope you find happiness." I'd read it without emotion, filed it away without responding. Jessica's apology was sincere, but it was also irrelevant. The woman who had betrayed our marriage for Helen's poison had made her choice, and choices have consequences that apologies can't erase. Marcus had vanished from Jessica's life as quickly as he'd entered it. The excitement of an affair with a married woman had lost its appeal once she was single and available. He'd moved on to new conquests, leaving Jessica to face the reality that she'd destroyed her marriage for someone who'd never been serious about her. The community had absorbed the lessons of Helen's manipulation with remarkable efficiency. Her reputation as a destroyer of marriages had become common knowledge, passed along through the careful sharing of truth by those who'd witnessed her work. She'd been forced to leave town entirely, relocating to a city where no one knew her history. I'd heard through Robert that Helen was working as a receptionist at a medical office, living in a small apartment, essentially starting over at 62 years old. The woman who had built her identity around manipulating others had been stripped of that power and reduced to ordinary survival. The poetic justice was perfect because it required no ongoing effort from me. Helen had created the very situation that destroyed her life. Her manipulation had been so thorough, so systematic, that once it was exposed, the consequences were inevitable and permanent. My own transformation had been just as complete, though in the opposite direction. I'd emerged from the experience stronger, wiser, and more at peace than I'd been in years. The strategic thinking that Helen's manipulation had awakened in me had become a permanent part of my character, but without the anger that had initially driven it. I was dating again, but with a different approach. The experience with Helen had taught me to recognize manipulation early, to identify the subtle signs of toxicity before they could take root. I'd developed strong boundaries and the confidence to enforce them, understanding that protecting my peace wasn't selfish, it was necessary. My relationship with Sarah, a teacher I'd met at the library, was built on mutual respect and shared values. She'd heard about my divorce through mutual friends and had asked me directly about what had happened. I told her the truth, simply and honestly, without drama or bitterness. "Some people are just toxic," she'd said after I'd finished the story. "The important thing is that you didn't let their poison change who you are." Sarah was right. I hadn't become bitter or cynical. Hadn't let Helen's manipulation turn me into someone I didn't recognize. I'd learned to be more cautious, more observant, more protective of my peace, but I'd maintained my fundamental decency throughout the entire ordeal. The house on Maple Street had been transformed as well. What had once felt empty and sad now felt peaceful and welcoming. I'd redecorated, had friends over for dinner, had created a space that reflected who I was rather than who I'd been with Jessica. Standing in my kitchen that morning, I reflected on the nature of revenge and justice. The best revenge hadn't been about destruction, it had been about revelation. I'd allowed Helen to reveal her true nature and face the natural consequences of her choices. By refusing to engage in drama or retaliation, I'd maintained my integrity while Helen destroyed herself with her own poison. The wisdom I'd gained was hard-won but valuable. Some people will always try to poison what you've built, but the key isn't fighting them. It's building something so strong that their poison can't touch it. And sometimes, the most powerful response is simply stepping back and letting toxic people face the consequences of their own actions. Helen's manipulation had been comprehensive and systematic, but it had also been self-defeating. She'd destroyed Jessica's marriage, her own marriage, and her relationship with her daughter in pursuit of some twisted vision of control and dominance. The poison she'd spread so carefully had finally reached its intended target, herself. The justice was poetic because it was natural, inevitable, and permanent. Helen had created the very situation that destroyed her life, and no amount of manipulation could undo the truth once it was revealed. She'd lost everything that mattered to her, because she'd chosen to destroy everything that mattered to others. I finished my coffee and prepared for work, feeling grateful for the peace I'd found and the lessons I'd learned. The experience had taught me that the most powerful victories are the ones where you don't have to become the villain, where truth and patience triumph over manipulation and poison. Helen was gone from my life, and I was stronger for having survived her assault on my happiness. The revenge was complete, and it was perfect. And that's the end of today's story. If you enjoyed it, please give this video a thumbs up and drop a comment below. Your support helps the algorithm push my content further. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It really helps me keep creating more stories for you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.